Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains barely surviving, oh god. And today we are going to discuss a bunch of locomotives, all steam locomotives actually, that did exactly that. As many of you know, many steam locomotives were scrapped at the end of the steam age and replaced with modern diesel units. If you've seen my video on the subject, you know this kick-started the preservation movement and encouraged people to try to preserve as many steam locomotives as they could, or rather, as many as they could afford. And several locomotives barely survived. They were very, very close to being scrapped, but for one reason or another, they managed to skimp by and wind up safely in preservation. Here's 5 trains that barely escaped being scrapped. Southern Pacific 4449. Also known as the Daylight, she is the only surviving example of Southern Pacific Railroad's GS4 line of steam locomotives. They were 484 Northern types. 28 of them were actually produced between 1941 and 1942 by Lima Locomotive Works, which I have historically called Lima, because that's what everyone around me always called it. People have different dialects, you know that? It's not just me mispronouncing everything. We all say things weird. You know what I mean whenever I say this stuff. That's all I'm trying to say. Semantics, people! Anyway, since they were produced in the early 40s, you know, they probably weren't very long for this world, and they weren't. Although Southern Pacific steam locomotives did survive a decent amount of time, a little over 10 years, 4449 was eventually officially retired on October 2nd, 1957, and she was placed into storage along with several of her sisters in Southern Pacific's Bakersfield Roundhouse. Most of them would be destined for the scrap heap, but in 1958, Southern Pacific decided they wanted to donate one of their locomotives to the city of Portland, Oregon. That's all well and good, but why did they choose 4449? Well, it was for a really, really dumb reason. Like a really dumb, lazy reason. It was only stupid luck and laziness that allowed 4449 to escape being scrapped. She just happened to be the first in the line of locomotives that were destined for the scrapyard. As a result, she was the easiest to move. That's the reason they picked 4449. It was no other reason other than just not wanting to do an excessive amount of work. Had she been in any other spot on that line, she would have been scrapped, and another locomotive, and there were several, would have taken her place. And history would be quite a lot different. 4449 would therefore survive being scrapped, but her fate would not exactly be pleasant. She was put on static display in Oaks Park in Portland, Oregon. But while she was there wasn't a lot of security. She was repeatedly vandalized and had many of her external parts stolen, including her builder's plate and her whistle. Her condition deteriorated very quickly, but there was a man by the name of Jack Holst. He was a Southern Pacific employee, and he took it upon himself privately to look after 4449, along with 2 other steam locomotives, Spokane, Portland, and Seattle 700, as well as Oregon Railroad and Navigation 197. He loved these locomotives, and he kept the engines, bearings, and rods oiled just in case they ever got the chance to move again. Sadly, he would pass away in 1972, and he never got to see 4449 eventually return to operation. Just 2 years after his death, his efforts would prove to not have been in vain. 4449 was evaluated for restoration because she was considered a candidate to pull the American Freedom Train. Her size, power, and streamlining made her a good fit for this job. When the inspectors saw that her bearings and rods were in very good shape, they opted to go with 4449. Despite the vandalism, because her actual workings were in good condition, she actually wouldn't be that difficult to get back up and running again. She was removed from the display on December 13, 1974, and restored at Burlington Northern Railroad's Hoyt Street Roundhouse in Portland, Oregon. She officially returned to operation April 21st, 1975, wearing a brand new coat of paint of red, white, and blue. She pulled the American Freedom Train throughout most of the United States. When the tour concluded, Amtrak decided to use her for a special, the Amtrak Transcontinental Steam Excursion, in 1977. And after that, she was returned to storage in Portland. This time, however, she was put under protective cover and no longer exposed to the elements or at high risk for vandalism. She was returned to her original orange daylight colors. For a long time between 1981 and 2012, she lived at Union Pacific's, which was formerly Southern Pacific's, Brooklyn Roundhouse in Portland, along with several other historic locomotives. But eventually, the Oregon Rail Heritage Foundation campaigned to construct a permanent, publicly accessible engine house for the city of Portland's steam locomotives. When the roundhouse closed in 2012, 4449 was moved, along with several other locomotives, to the Oregon Rail Heritage Center, which is a new restoration facility and public interpretive center adjacent to the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. It opened to the public on September 22, 2012, and she remains there to this day. A happy ending for such a great locomotive overall, but I still can't get over the fact that the only reason she lived was because her owners were lazy. They just didn't want to move anything else. They were like, she's there. Take her. What a way to survive. But before we move on, a brief mention from our sponsor. Do you like learning new things? Then perhaps you should give Skillshare a try. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for anyone who loves learning and wants to explore their creativity and learn new skills. Invest in yourself and your personal growth. Have a specific skill you're trying to learn? Skillshare is the perfect place to start. From photography and illustration to graphic design, freelancing, and more, you can find classes that will match your goals and interests. And I think a lot of you could find some serious use out of one particular course on Skillshare. In a fantastic lesson given to us by Dale McManus, he teaches people how to use just their smartphones to take professional-grade pictures. And I know a lot of y'all like taking pictures of trains you find. Well, wouldn't it be nice to make them the best they could possibly be? There's a ton of stuff in this course, it's only an hour long, that I didn't even know that my phone could do. And he's not the only one with a great course like this that could teach you how to take professional-grade photos with equipment you may be carrying around in your own pocket. And of course you don't have to take my word for it. By clicking the link down in the description, the first 1,000 of you can get a free trial over at Skillshare and give it an honest try. So invest in yourself over at Skillshare. The London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway A1X class, sometimes called Terriers, Stepney. Oh yes, Stepney. Yes, it's that Stepney. This Stepney. The same Stepney that we're all familiar with from the Thomas the Tank Engine series. He's one of the most literal basises in that series, in that Reverend W. Awdry didn't even change his name. He lives on the Bluebell Railway, is often referred to as a he, and his name is still Stepney. The whole story was meant to celebrate Stepney's survival into preservation and the existence of the Bluebell Railway. The Bluebell Railway, by the way, was the first standard-gauged, steam-operated passenger heritage railway in the world to operate a public service. The owners and operators actually ran their first train on the 7th of August 1960, which was less than 3 years after the line from East Grinstead to Lewis was closed by British Railways. Ugh, of course you had to come into this. Originally he was just an A1, and they were tank engines, as you can see. Perhaps a little bit on the small side, but they were actually extremely good. They were probably one of the better tank engines manufactured in their day. Their only major flaw was that they had wooden brakes initially, and wooden brakes had a nasty habit of catching fire if they were overused. Eventually these were replaced with metal brakes, which were a lot safer in that regard. They carried out push-pull trains as well as branch line duties, and he was one of 17 A1s that was selected to be converted into an A1X. The changes made them more modern and more powerful, but interestingly, Stepney was the only A1X that wasn't eventually reverted back to an A1. Stepney remains an A1X even now. But how was he saved? I mean, how did he even last that long? Mind you, the A1s were manufactured in 1875. Stepney is old for a locomotive. Well, he actually survived long enough to be under the control of British Railways. But during their modernization plan, of course, they saw fit to destroy all the steam engines, because this is what they do. Stepney was, of course, selected pretty early on in that period, and sometime in the late 50s, to be scrapped. By the point he was taken out of service, he was already 85 years old. Stepney was already on the chopping block just because of his age. He was almost a century old. But Stepney, interestingly, wasn't actually sent to the scrapyard, at least not immediately. He was found on an out-of-use sighting by the Bluebell Railway Preservation Society in May of 1960. He was just chilling there. Presumably British Rail planned on sending Stepney to the scrapyard at some point, but hadn't actually got around to it. The Bluebell Railway approached British Rail about the locomotive, who agreed to sell it to them because they were going to scrap him anyway. And Stepney wound up being the very first standard gauge steam locomotive that was preserved and restored in the United Kingdom. It was sheer luck that they found him when they did, otherwise they might not have been able to save him. But he's become a very popular attraction on the Bluebell Railway, hauling both passenger and freight services on occasion. His age, of course, means that he's had to deal with several overhauls over the years, and despite being easily the most famous, again due to Reverend W. Awdry's story about him, he's actually not the oldest. His brother, Fenchurch, is actually 3 years older than him, at 147 years old. Stepney is 144. Both, of course, are nearly a century and a half old, which is just ludicrous, and as a result of his age, Stepney actually doesn't run very much anymore. He was extensively used in his early preservation days in the 1960s, but his running ability has been restricted due to the cost of future overhauls. In recent years, it's been his frame, boiler, and cylinders that have been wearing out. The cost of fixing that is going to be very expensive. And while it's likely that, of course, Bluebell will keep him around, how easily it'll be to fix him and put him back into actual service remains to be seen. But still, he has a heck of a story behind him, and it's nice that we have such an old preserved steam locomotive still on the rails to this day. The Norfolk and Western 611. Oh yeah, the spirit of Roanoke, the Queen of Steam 611, is a Class J 484 Northern type steam locomotive, and the Norfolk and Western J's were nothing to sneer at. They were streamlined by default. It was literally built into their design, and they were considered incredible, probably one of the best kinds of steam locomotives constructed in their day. A solid example of what some might consider the pinnacle of United States steam locomotive technology. Only 14 wound up being produced between 1941 and 1950, and they operated in a lot of mountainous terrain, but did a solid job at it. 611 is the only survivor of her sisters. She's pulled many excursion trains over the years, and was actually put back into excursion service in the last decade or so. Otherwise, she tends to sit at the Virginia Museum of Transportation. But why did she live? How did she survive when none of her sisters did? Every other one was scrapped. Well, weirdly, it was due to an accident. I've talked about this in a previous video. The Queen of Steam has actually been involved in 2 crashes. The second one wasn't really her fault. The first one had her flying off the rails. The report officially said it was due to excessive speed, and it actually killed the engineer on board. However, the accident happened in 1956. The J's were all retired and scrapped between 1958 and 1959. There wasn't very much time for any wear and tear to happen on 611, and as a result, due to the repairs that were conducted on her, she was in remarkably good condition. A member of Southern Railway's board, one William Graham Clayton Jr., was a big fan of trains. He was also an attorney, a United States naval officer, managed to personally convince Norfolk and Western to donate 611 to what was at the time the Roanoke Transportation Museum. Specifically because of her accident, she was in the best condition, and he felt that at least one of these great locomotives should be preserved. Norfolk and Western concurred with the thought process and sent 611 to the museum. The rest, of course, is history. She's been a remarkably famous locomotive in United States railroad history, and continues to run to this day. Right now, she's actually been visiting the Strasburg Railroad in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. As of the most recent information, she's currently remaining there for her annual FRA inspection and maintenance to her boiler stay bolts. And there's no better place to get that job done than Strasburg. easily one of the best heritage railways in the country. They know how to take care of their steam locomotives, and I'm sure 611 is in good hands over there. It's just so weird to think that an accident, a tragic one, that killed her engineer is the only reason why she wound up preserved. Go figure. The New York Central Mohawks. This is kind of a double entry, as there were two Mohawks that wound up being preserved from New York Central in the mid-1950s. Now, any of you who have been watching my videos a while are probably a little confused because, wait a minute, this is New York Central. Alfred E. Perlman didn't want any steam locomotives from New York Central to survive into preservation. He was dead set against it because he felt that if any survived, it would make his company look old and outdated, even if they were just in preservation. Perlman gets a lot of flack for this, and many have pointed out that I'm a little mean to him, as he did make some genuinely good business decisions, and I won't take that away from him. What I will say is that in this particular instance, when it came to his position on preservation, I think he was wrong. That's where I'm at with it. And it was specifically due to his policy of pro-scrapping and anti-preservation that both the Hudsons and the Niagaras all wound up scrapped, and the Mohawks mostly did. The Mohawks were 482 type steam locomotives. That wheel arrangement is sometimes just called the Mohawk type, although other places call it the mountain type. Either way, they were named after the Mohawk River, and there were actually many versions of them. The L1s, L2s, L3s, and L4s. And overall, they were very good locomotives with a maximum speed of 80 miles per hour, capable of pulling just about whatever you wanted, even though the L1s and L2s were known to be a bit unstable at high speeds. But how did two of them wind up preserved if Alfred E. Perlman was very much like, "Boys, where on earth is that last Mohawk? I want it destroyed." Sir, don't you have anything else to do? I told you that we're looking for the last steam engine. We'll let you know where it's at. Yeah, again, I don't even know what a steam engine is. Barry, please stop saying that. I want it in pieces, shreds. Every last remnant of steam technology on this railway must be obliterated. Are we sure we should be working for this guy? I mean, he pays us fairly well, solid benefits, so it could be worse. Could it? The reason why two of the Mohawks survived, 2933, who was an L2D, and 3001, who was an L3A, was because of two kind of flukes, to be honest. They just slipped through the cracks. Alfred E. Perlman's net was pretty wide, and he was pretty thorough, but these two managed to escape for two completely different reasons. In 3001's case, she was actually sold in 1957 to the Texas and Pacific Railroad, as they needed a replacement for another locomotive, Texas and Pacific number 638, who'd been heavily vandalized and scrapped when she was on display at the Texas State Fairgrounds. They renumbered her to Texas and Pacific 909, and since she was under their jurisdiction now, they saw fit to donate her to the city of Dallas, Texas. Then, even later, the city donated her to the Museum of the American Railroad, which is also in Dallas. The only reason she lived is because New York Central sold her to Texas and Pacific. Had she stayed with New York Central, she almost certainly would have been scrapped. Eventually, 3001 found her way to Indiana, after being acquired by the Lakeshore Railroad Historical Foundation. Currently, she's still in Indiana, sitting on static display at the National New York Central Railroad Museum. I wonder if Alfred E. Perlman knew she got away. Boys, where is 3001? I brought my chainsaw! You sold her to Texas and Pacific last week. We talked about this. We even asked you if you were sure. Well, I agreed to sell her, but I thought we were going to scrap her still. We can't scrap her now. That's Texas and Pacific's prerogative. They own her. Should we run now? Yes, we should run. As for 2933, well, she survived for more direct reasons when it came to New York Central. She was actually chosen to be used as a stationary steam boiler for their shops into the early 60s. Because of her use in this particular context, she survived a lot longer than any of her sisters, even under New York Central jurisdiction. In 1962, New York Central received a letter from the museum director at the National Museum of Transportation in Kirkwood, Missouri, asking if they could maybe please, instead of destroying that historical steam locomotive, maybe they could just give it to them. Rumor has it that the locomotive actually only lived that long because several New York Central employees actually hid her behind large boxes in a roundhouse in Selkirk, New York. Now, there's actually no evidence that that ever occurred, although other locomotives did survive in that manner. In this instance, it was because of the request for the museum director. Either way, someone made the decision to be like, yes, send it down there before Alfred finds out. And 2933 has been safe at the museum on static display ever since.
What do you mean you intentionally donated one of our steam locomotives? I said they should all be eradicated like the scum they are.
Okay, first of all, you know I'm a regular engineer. I did not make that decision. Not that I disagree with it. And second of all, talk to your board members, man. We don't know. Yeah, we really don't know. I still don't know what a steam engine is. Would you stop it, Barry?
I want that 2933. I'm gonna go to the museum and destroy everything they own, including all the other steam locomotives.
Boss, have a Snickers.
Why?
Because you're not yourself when you're hungry.
I want that steam engine!
Oh, that didn't work! I know it didn't! The Great Western Railway 4900 class 5972 Olton Hall. I've had people request for me to talk about old Olton Hall here for quite a long time, so I suppose that's totally fair. As much like many steam locomotives over in the UK, he barely escaped the modernization plan that was inflicted upon the rail lines by British Rail. He was first constructed on the 30th of April 1937 as a 460 tender engine. It was designed by Charles Collett and built by Great Western Railway's Swindon Works. Even under British Rail, he survived into the 60s and wasn't withdrawn until December of 1963 and was sold for scrap. But fortunately for Olton, he wound up in the one place where all scrapped engines were, at least for a while, rather safe, at the Woodham Brothers scrapyard. The Woodham Brothers took a lot of locomotives to be scrapped from British Rail, but they didn't actually scrap a lot of them immediately, as it was more profitable for them to scrap the cars first, not the locomotives. As a result, a lot of the steam engines just sat around, and preservationists grew wise to this. In fact, Olton was there nearly 2 decades, just chillin', before the Woodham Brothers finally sold him to a man named David Smith. Olton was moved to Horbury Railway Works in Wakefield in May of 1981. He remained there, kinda, again, just chillin', when he was finally moved in 1994 to Carnsforth MPD for official restoration, and was brought up to steam again for the first time since his retirement in 1998. The thing about Olton, in particular, that makes him more unique than a lot of steam locomotives isn't just a story for escaping scrap. Olton went on to not just be a preserved running example of a steam locomotive, but he was the locomotive chosen to represent the engine that pulls the Hogwarts Express. Yeah, the Harry Potter series. That locomotive you see in the movies, the one that was talked about in the books, that takes all the wizards and witches to Hogwarts to learn about magic, that's Olton Hall. He was dolled up with a Hogwarts Express headboard on his smokebox, as well as the Hogwarts school crest on his side. He kept his number, 5972, but he was given a new name for his role, simply called the Hogwarts Castle. He was painted crimson, which is a non-standard color, as Great Western Railway's locomotives are usually known to be green, but they wanted him to stand out, and admittedly he looked great in the movie. They could have easily just made a CGI locomotive and been done with it, but they actually used a real, actual, running, preserved steam engine, and I think that's phenomenal. The scenes he's in were filmed at the King's Cross Railway Station, the Glenfinnan Viaduct, and the North Yorkshire Moors Railway. Interestingly, Olton wasn't actually the initial locomotive chosen. To promote the 4th book, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Southern Railway West Country class locomotive 34027 Taw Valley was actually repainted and renamed to represent the Express, but she was rejected by the film's director Chris Columbus as he thought that engine looked a bit too modern for the film. So they went with Olton instead. Due to the incredible popularity and success of the Harry Potter franchise, Olton has become kind of a celebrity in that regard. In fact, there are 3 full-size replicas of him as 5972 Hogwarts Castle. One's at the Wizarding World of Harry Potter at Universal Orlando Resort, one is part of the Hogwarts Express train ride, and another is a static display at the Hogsmeade area. There are also stunning static models of him at the Wizarding World of Harry Potter locations in Hollywood and Japan. The point is, Olton Hall didn't just escape being scrapped and become a simple running example of a steam locomotive. That in itself would be quite an achievement, but because of his role in Harry Potter, he's become almost an icon of that series, to the point that they make replicas of him even though he still currently physically exists. Like, I can't think of another example of a steam locomotive where that kind of thing has happened. If you build a replica of a steam locomotive, it's usually because the original is no longer there. But Olton's still around, and people are making replicas of him because Harry Potter. Go figure. He doesn't just do Harry Potter stuff these days. He's used in other excursion service on occasion, under his actual name, Olton Hall. And as of 2015, he's actually been sitting on static display at Warner Brothers Studio Tour London, The Making of Harry Potter, which is near Watford. He's supposed to be displayed there until the lease that Warner Brothers has from West Coast Railways expires, and as of now that hasn't happened yet, so that's where he is. I'm sure eventually that lease will expire, and he'll be put back to steam once again, because talk about a career! He didn't just survive the Cutter's Torch, he went on to be one of the most recognizable locomotives in the world, just because he became a film star. And that's a solid victory overall. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Sumdu267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Tribal Typhoon, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Lock Kraken, Twin Fox, Dimeblade 17, and Anzac A1. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.